France admits Black Jesus is reshaping global Catholic faith. Something is stirring beneath the stone and silence of France's oldest churches, a theological tremor, quiet yet relentless, unsettling the foundations of centuries-old tradition. Within cathedrals whose walls have absorbed the breath of generations, where incense still hangs like memory in the air, a new face of Christ is emerging, and it does not resemble the imperial Christ of white marble and golden halos. France is undergoing not a spectacle, but a reckoning, not a rebellion, but a resurrection. It is the rise of Black Jesus, not as iconographic variation or token inclusion, but as an ontological intervention. This is no mere artistic revision. It is a metaphysical confrontation with the inherited grammar of the sacred, a disruption of the long-held assumption that divinity must resemble dominance. What is unfolding is a philosophical revolution, challenging the Church's most uncomfortable question. What happens when God no longer looks like Caesar, but like the colonized? This movement is not superficial. It is sacramental. It does not seek to decorate the liturgy, but to deconstruct the legacy of power embedded within it. It dares to ask, can a faith built upon the incarnation survive if it continually falsifies the flesh of the incarnate? For generations, the French Church presented a Christ rendered in the image of whiteness, a face sculpted by empire, not by history. And now, for the first time in centuries, the veil is lifting. Black Jesus appears not as a threat, but as a truth long exiled. In his presence, France, the land of enlightenment, of Rousseau and Joan of Arc, of baptism and burning, must look into the mirror of its colonial past and ask whether it has ever truly seen the face of God. As a theologian and witness to this unfolding moment, I tell you this: the shift is not cosmetic, it is cosmic. The Church is not simply changing its art, it is being called to account. And if this vision continues to spread, it will not be France alone that must answer these questions. It will be the world. If this kind of content moves you, challenges you, or simply makes you think differently about faith and history, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear how this divine disruption speaks to you. The face of God was never white. Why French experts say it's time to correct the record. The image of Jesus Christ as a white man, serene, pale skin, soft-featured, crowned in chestnut waves, has, for centuries, dominated not only the canvases of sacred art and the interiors of stone cathedrals, but the metaphysical architecture of the Western imagination itself. In France, a nation at once the custodian of Catholic tradition and the architect of colonial domination, this image functions not as a benign artistic convention, but as a profound expression of theological hegemony. It is not the historical Jesus of Nazareth whom we encounter in these sacred depictions, but rather the idealized figure of European authority, constructed to mirror the aesthetic and political values of empire. This Jesus is shaped not by the Galilean soil into which he was born, but by the palette of Renaissance privilege. Not by the humility of a carpenter's life, but by the distant and exalted gaze of European supremacy. Thus emerges a theological whiteness, not accidental but strategic, a metaphysical device fashioned to reinforce colonial hierarchy and ecclesial dominance. French scholars now interrogate this whiteness, not as incidental imagery, but as an intentional project, a theological whitening that functions simultaneously as aesthetic choice and ideological weapon. In the era of French imperial expansion, missionaries did not simply carry the gospel to Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. They carried an image of God curated to resemble the colonizer. The Christ they offered was not born in Bethlehem, but reconstructed in Bordeaux. His features aligned with the dominant race, his holiness fused with the optics of power. This was no innocent portrait. It was a visual catechesis of control. The divine resembled the European master, and holiness became racialized. To approach God was to ascend toward whiteness. To remain dark was to remain peripheral to sanctity. French missionaries, armored in religious conviction and colonial ideology, delivered a visual theology calibrated not to liberate, but to domesticate, rendering Christ as the twin of the conqueror and salvation as a process of assimilation. As Professor Etienne Roch of the Sorbonne incisively observes, to civilize was to Christianize, and to Christianize was to reimagine God in the image of whiteness. What he articulates is not the evolution of Christian art, but the ossification of a colonial metaphysics wherein the sacred becomes indistinguishable from the imperial. Whiteness in this schema was not merely normative, it was divine. Yet within this ecclesial edifice, a quiet revolution has begun. A new generation of French theologians, scholars, and clergy, often hailing from post-colonial lineages themselves, have initiated a slow but deliberate dismantling of what they now term the iconography of dominance. Their aim is not iconoclasm in the classical sense. They do not seek the destruction of religious images, but their interrogation. Their central philosophical question is as disruptive as it is essential. What have we done to the face of come, and what has that face done to us? This is not a superficial aesthetic critique. It is an ontological crisis. At stake is the very nature of the incarnation, the foundational Christian claim that God became flesh. And flesh, as an ontological reality, is never neutral. Flesh bears the marks of color, culture, geography, and history. To depict that flesh falsely is not merely to misrepresent pigment, it is to distort the scandalous reality of divine embodiment. Dr. Malika Sissoko, one of the most lucid voices in this theological reawakening, insists with intellectual precision and emotional clarity, to render Christ as white is not neutral. It is a theological lie that has wounded generations, especially those whose own flesh was made a curse by the Church's silence. In this single assertion lies the essence of the crisis. For members of the African and Caribbean diaspora in France, the white Christ has never offered sanctuary. He has offered judgment. He has been less a sign of universal love than of racial exclusion, a divine mirror in which they could not find themselves. Theological whiteness, then, becomes not only a matter of iconographic preference, but of metaphysical violence. It casts blackness as peripheral, unsanctified, and other. Thus, the call to reclaim a historically and ethnically accurate Christ is not about progressive politics or trendy multiculturalism. It is fundamentally a cry for metaphysical repair, a return to truth. To correct the record, to depict Jesus not as Caesar's heir, but as a brown-skinned son of an occupied people, is not merely an academic gesture. It is a liturgical act of repentance. It is theology in pigment. It is a sacramental affirmation that the divine chose to enter the world not as a projection of dominance, but as an embodiment of the marginalized. Across France, in seminaries, sacred art studios, and theological colloquia, this correction is taking root. What is emerging is a French Catholic imagination no longer beholden to the aesthetics of empire, but open to the truth of incarnation. This new vision does not reject tradition, it seeks to purify it. It does not erase the Christ of the past, it demands that he be seen more fully. If Christ is Emmanuel, God with us, then he must be God with all of us, not only those whose features aligned with European beauty, but also those whose histories have been written in the margins of empire. This is not a diminution of divinity, it is the retrieval of its most radical claim that God entered the world in a particular body, among a particular people, under a particular system of oppression. To depict Jesus in historically plausible terms is to recover the explosive truth of the gospel, that divinity does not reside in abstraction, but in the particularity of the oppressed. And so a movement grows, slow, deliberate, fierce. France, once the exporter of theological whiteness, now becomes its critic. In sacred spaces where the white Christ once stood unchallenged, a brown-skinned Jesus now begins to rise, tentative, luminous, necessary. These new images are not simply revisions of art, they are restorations of hope. They are theological events, visual proclamations that the divine has never been the property of the powerful. As this shift unfolds, it challenges every believer not merely to ask what they believe, but whom they see when they believe. It compels a deeper reckoning. Are we willing to let go of the Christ shaped by our comfort in order to meet the one shaped by truth? The face of God was never white. And now, France, in the quiet beauty of reimagined sanctuaries and the bold voices of its theologians, is daring to look again. And in that sacred act of looking, heaven itself is being repainted. Black Jesus in Paris, inside the French churches quietly repainting heaven. In the marrow of Paris, where aesthetics, empire, and the sacred converge, a quiet ontological upheaval is taking place, not through grand proclamations, but through silent, luminous acts of metaphysical rebellion. Within the walls of Église Saint-Michel de Lyon, nestled between postmodern cafes and neoclassical museums that curate the legacy of European cultural supremacy, heaven is being reimagined, not metaphorically but materially. In pigment, glass, and form, the image of Christ has begun to shift. No longer clothed in the pallor of Renaissance idealism, he now emerges with unmistakable African features, deep umber skin, coiled hair, inscribed with ancestral memory, and a countenance shaped by the burdens of historical trauma. This transformation is not merely artistic innovation or symbolic inclusion, it is a theological rupture, a reconfiguration of sacred epistemology. It is iconography reborn as resistance. For this Christ is not auxiliary, he is not a cultural accommodation. He is the Christ, centered, crucified, resurrected, and dark-skinned. In his visage, the pale aesthetics of empire are displaced by a new metaphysical grammar, wherein divinity no longer conforms to the image of the dominant, but to the story of the oppressed. Yet, this phenomenon is not confined to a single Parisian church. It is a broader ecclesial awakening, one that is germinating throughout France's liturgical landscape, from the working-class parishes of Marseille to the contemplative corridors of Lyon. It is neither an imposed reform nor a reactionary wave. Rather, it arises organically from the embodied theology of congregants whose lives have long existed outside the visual canon of the church. For centuries, French Catholic sanctuaries have been adorned with alabaster saints, flaxen-haired Madonnas, and Christs who reflect the visage of colonial sanctity. Now, for the first time, these sacred walls echo a counter-litany that sanctity is not white, that the divine can wear many faces, and that what we sanctify in stone and stained glass ultimately shapes our metaphysical intuitions. The introduction of Black iconography, then, is not an aesthetic revision, but a theological recalibration. It challenges the deeply rooted visual hegemony of Western Christianity and posits an alternative ontology, one grounded not in hierarchy, but in the incarnational multiplicity of God. This theological renovation is not without tension. Many within the institutional church, bound by tradition or wary of ideological polarization, tread cautiously. Priests whisper their support. Bishops avert their gaze. Yet the transformation continues, not by papal decree, but through grassroots metaphysical insurgency. At its heart is a pastoral impulse, one captured eloquently by Father Lucien Dabadie of Marseille, a scholar of liberation theology and a practitioner of incarnational fidelity. Explaining the decision to place a black crucifix at the center of his parish's altar, he affirms, "We needed our children to see themselves in salvation history, not as shadows in a Eurocentric mythos, but as protagonists in the drama of redemption." And the Christ that presides over this altar does not merely bear the wounds of Calvary. He bears the imprints of colonization, the fractures of historical erasure, and the resilience of dignity hard-earned. Sculpted by Congolese-French artist Aimé Mabala, this Jesus is lean, mournful, suffering. His crown of thorns not only a symbol of divine sorrow, but of the racialized violence sewn into the history of faith. This is no ornamental Messiah. This is the Christ of the underside, the enslaved, the lynched, the discarded. And precisely in that abandonment, he becomes more fully divine. Naturally, such portrayals have provoked outrage in traditionalist circles. The emergence of Black Christ imagery has been labeled heresy, accused of desecrating sacred art, of succumbing to the perceived threat of identity politics. Critics argue that these depictions dilute orthodoxy, that they fracture ecclesial unity. Yet those who create and venerate these icons offer a counter-argument that cuts deeper than polemic. As Mbala himself contends, We are not erasing the old Jesus. We are resurrecting the whole Christ, the one who reflects all flesh, all sorrow, all beauty. His claim is not relativism, it is radical incarnationalism. The divine in this vision is not constrained by Eurocentric aesthetics, but explodes through particularity. The sacred does not reside in uniformity, but in multiplicity. Black Jesus, therefore, is not a political assertion. He is a metaphysical necessity. In a nation where laïcité renders public religiosity suspect and where the Enlightenment project sought to demystify the sacred, this kind of theological reimagining possesses unusual power. These images speak more loudly than creeds. They bypass academic theology and pierce the existential space of the beholder. They ask, whose image have we exalted in the sanctuary of our souls? And more urgently, what are the consequences of worshiping a God who always looks like the ruling class? In this light, the Black Christ becomes not an aesthetic variation, but a philosophical provocation. He calls the white believer to decenter themselves, not in guilt, but in humility. He invites the marginalized to locate themselves in the sacred narrative. And he commands the church to remember that the incarnation was never abstraction, never theory, but flesh. And flesh, in theological terms, is never neutral. Flesh is where divinity risks itself. It is the space in which the eternal becomes temporal, where the invisible becomes visible. To restrict the range of incarnate depiction is to reduce the scope of revelation. In that reduction, the church unwittingly perpetuates the logic of exclusion. Thus, what is unfolding in these French churches is not a liturgical trend. It is a metaphysical correction, a recovery of the scandalous truth that the kingdom of God is not confined to whiteness. To depict Christ as black is not to localize him, but to fulfill the incarnation's demand, that the divine meet us in the particular, in the wounded, in the forgotten. In this unfolding vision, France finds itself, paradoxically and prophetically, repainting heaven. With each brushstroke, each statue, each stained glass window, it is not erasing the past, but transfiguring it, not abandoning tradition, but purifying it, not discarding the Christ of memory, but unveiling the Christ of truth, the one who looks not like empire, but like everyone empire tried to erase. Beneath these evolving icons, in the hush of stone chapels and beneath the flickering light of votive candles, something ancient is being born anew. And if we have the courage to see it, to truly see, we may come to realize that it is not the divine that has changed. It is we who are finally ready to behold him. From heresy to healing, why France's youth are flocking to Black Jesus. Amid the Gothic spires and dimming echoes of once mighty chants, something profound is stirring in the ecclesial marrow of France, not among its clerical elders or monastic scholars, but in the restless, often disillusioned hearts of its youth. In a nation marked by post-Enlightenment secularism and liturgical fatigue, where cathedrals have become more historical artifact than spiritual refuge, a return is unfolding. And it is radical not because it reinvents the sacred, but because it reclaims it. Young French Catholics, particularly those of African and Caribbean descent, are making their way back to the church, but not to the marble white Christ of Eurocentric piety, not to a God abstracted from their history and their pain. They return to Black Jesus, not as an aesthetic novelty or cultural concession, but as a metaphysical imperative. For generations, the church in France proclaimed a gospel of universal love, while lifting up images of a Savior who bore none of their features, embodied none of their suffering, and understood none of their exile. This dissonance between the proclaimed universality of grace and the racial particularity of representation produced a spiritual alienation that no sermon could remedy. In the space between the pulpit and the icon, between the word and the flesh, many young souls quietly drifted. Now, however, that alienation is being metabolized into theological clarity. The return is not loud, but it is sacred. It is not driven by spectacle, but by recognition, ontological recognition. In the image of Black Jesus, these youth find not merely a revision of iconography, but a sacramental mirror. They are seen, not symbolically, but sacramentally, not merely as recipients of grace, but as bearers of sacred history. The re-engagement is as much philosophical as it is spiritual. A new generation of theologians, poets, and scholars is rereading Scripture through the prisms of post-colonial critique, liberation theology, and the embodied knowledge of racialized existence. The Gospels, long dulled by ecclesial familiarity, recover their prophetic sharpness. Christ emerges not as a remote moral exemplar, but as a brown-skinned revolutionary, one who stood at the margins of power, broke bread with the untouchable, transgressed purity laws, and was executed not for neutrality but for defying imperial logic. For these young believers, the crucifixion is no longer an abstraction floating above history. It is a mirror reflecting the wounds of colonization, the traumas of slavery, and the daily violences of systemic exclusion, from Haiti's plantations to the concrete banlieues of Paris. Black Jesus is not a metaphor. He is an ontological claim, an existential theology. He is the God who remembers, who bleeds not just for the marginalized, but as the marginalized. As Dr. Leah Konate, a religious sociologist in Toulouse, asserts, there is a hunger for deep spiritual connection, but what she names goes deeper than longing. It is a cry for ontological healing. These young Catholics are not seeking representation in the shallow political sense. They seek a Christ who understands, who embodies, who remembers. In a world that continually tells them they do not belong, not in beauty, not in history, not in power, the Black Christ tells them, you are holy precisely as you are. For Elie Mboko, a 22-year-old from Strasbourg, the encounter with Black Jesus was not an aesthetic surprise, but a theological awakening. For the first time in my life, he confesses, I see a Jesus who understands what it means to be feared, to be followed in a store, to be questioned just for existing. In this simple testimony lies a seismic truth. Theology is not merely about intellectual systems. It is about survival. It is about the possibility of finding in the divine one's own story, one's exile, one's resilience, and discovering that it too is sacred. For these youth, the church is no longer merely a cathedral of ritual. It becomes a sanctuary of reclamation, a theological battleground where identity is no longer erased in the name of unity, but embraced in the name of incarnation. The Christ they now venerate is not the sanitized redeemer of Western piety. He is the wounded one, the one who descended not just into hell, but into history. This return, quiet but courageous, constitutes a philosophical rupture at the heart of the French Church. For too long, the institution found safety in tradition, in rational order, in artistic sublimity. But in so doing, it forgot the scandal of the Incarnation, that God chose not neutrality but specificity, not the throne but the manger, not the empire but the margins. These youth in their return are not merely coming back. They are confronting the church with their presence, their memory, and their theological demands. They are holding a mirror to the church and saying, this is what Christ looks like in history. Can you still recognize him? They are not just students of doctrine. They are now its teachers. They are reintroducing the church to the gospel it once proclaimed, a gospel that was never meant to affirm power, but to overturn it. And in a society increasingly indifferent to religion, it is this very radicalism, not authority, not tradition, not grandeur, that is making the church matter again. Black Jesus is not an icon to be accommodated. He is an epistemological rupture. He is a portal through which an entire generation enters, bringing justice, identity, and embodiment into conversation with the sacred. He is not the opposite of Christ. He is the fullness of Christ, refracted through the wounds of history. And in this refracting light, the church begins to remember its own soul, not built upon the aesthetic ideals of whiteness, but upon the scandalous flesh of a suffering God. Black Jesus is not afraid of history. He is not afraid of memory. And the healing he offers does not begin with forgetting. It begins with seeing. To see him fully, historically, unflinchingly, is to see ourselves. And in that sight, to begin again. A divine disruption. What the Vatican thinks versus what France is doing. Within the solemn chambers of the Roman Church, a theological structure older than nations, whose stones have absorbed the tensions of schism, heresy, and historical upheaval, disruption is rarely welcomed as renewal. It is more often met with ritualized silence, the weight of caution, and the inertia of sacred preservation. Thus, when France begins to reimagine the divine, not in abstract liturgical language, but through the literal reformation of Christ's image, the Vatican responds not with proclamation, but with studied stillness. And yet silence within such a symbolic institution is never neutral. It functions as both gesture and judgment, as both hesitation and restraint. The French ecclesial movement, wherein Christ is being rendered in darker flesh and broader histories, presses against more than just iconographic conventions. It challenges the Church's deepest ontological commitments to universality, to incarnation, and to the very nature of representation. French bishops, caught between the solemn architecture of Roman continuity and the rising, urgent tremors of the faithful, navigate a philosophical burden. Some cling to doctrinal immutability, fearing that embracing a black Jesus may destabilize theological symmetry or rupture the so-called Catholicity, that is, the universality, of the Church's visible tradition. Others, such as Bishop Claude Tremblay of Lyon, speak with a different voice, one shaped by metaphysical openness. We are not creating a new religion, he insists. We are rediscovering the breadth of the one we already have. This is not an innovation of belief, but a retrieval of truths long occluded by the historical filters of power. Yet this disruption refuses containment. It does not lend itself to liturgical management or aesthetic compromise. It exposes the fragility of theological frameworks that have, for centuries, rendered the divine in a single racialized form. The questions raised by the French movement are not rhetorical. They are metaphysical provocations. Can a theology that claims universality remain credible when its central figure is only ever depicted through whiteness? Can a church truly honor the scandal of the incarnation if its iconography is shaped not by the margins of Galilee, but by the centers of empire? And most crucially, can healing occur without confession, not of individual sin, but of structural complicity in the colonial racialized project that shaped Christian aesthetics and theology alike? These are not inquiries about art history. They are demands placed upon the very ground of theological coherence. France, a nation paradoxically defined by militant secularism and deep Catholic roots, now finds itself, perhaps unwillingly, leading one of the most profound theological reckonings of the modern era. For in lifting the image of Black Jesus, French theologians and clergy are not simply calling for a revision of form. They are articulating a radical reorientation of vision, a vision grounded not in the imperial legacy of Constantine, but in the fragile brown flesh of a newborn in Bethlehem, born into Roman occupation, wrapped not in royal linen, but in political vulnerability. This act of reclamation demands not only institutional courage, but philosophical depth. It is not the defiance of rebellion for its own sake, but a disciplined, contemplative embrace of paradox, that the divine is both absolute and particular, that universality cannot be defined by erasure, that to represent Christ as Black is not to limit his reach, but to rescue his presence from abstraction. The God of Christianity is not spirit alone, he is incarnate. He did not descend in ethereal light, but entered history through a body, through skin, through circumstance. And skin in a post-colonial world is never without meaning. To pretend otherwise is to perpetuate the illusion of neutrality that has historically served the powerful. What France is articulating, perhaps more through stained glass and sculpture than through official dogma, is a theology of the incarnate real, a God who bleeds not just with humanity in general, but with the colonized, the racialized, the forsaken. This vision does not undermine Catholicism. It fulfills it. For what does it mean to confess credo in unum Deum, qui propter nos homines et propter nostrum salutem descendit de caelis, if not that God came not for abstraction, but for the flesh of the historically wounded. And so while Rome holds its breath in uneasy stillness, France dares to breathe anew. In the sacred interiors of its churches, Christ emerges no longer as the sanitized redeemer of empire, but as the black messiah of the margins. Stained glass windows glimmer with forms once unthinkable in Catholic space. Sculptures once conformed to Hellenistic idealism now embody the texture of African ancestry. And pulpits, once echo chambers of apologetic decorum, now ring with sermons that name injustice, colonial, racial, and ecclesial, as theological concerns. And within this unfolding drama, the most unexpected movement occurs. The people return, not because they believe the church has solved its contradictions, but because it has begun, however haltingly, to confront them. The doubters come, not in search of certainty, but in search of space. The forgotten come, not to be tolerated, but to be seen. And those long relegated to the edges, black, brown, immigrant, exiled, come because in the face of the crucified, they finally recognize themselves. This is not mere reform. It is eschatological rupture. It is the breaking in of a kingdom that has always belonged to the poor in spirit, but was too often painted in the colors of power. And as Christ is recast in darker flesh, a long-suppressed truth becomes impossible to ignore. Black is not the opposite of holy. It is not corruption, deviation, or dilution. It is the color of flesh, of history, of incarnation. To say so, publicly, reverently, theologically, is not to commit heresy, but to recover hope. France, once the intellectual heart of Enlightenment rationalism, now stands at the threshold of spiritual renaissance, not because it has rejected the past, but because it has dared to tell the whole truth of it. And in doing so, it offers the church and the world a renewed image of God, not more distant, but more real. Not more transcendent, but more human. In this act of divine disruption, the sacred expands, not into chaos, but into clarity, not into novelty, but into the long-awaited fullness of redemption.